Yes. All right. Did you guys enjoy the archaeology chapter? No?
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think archaeology has always been fascinating.
Yeah.
Digging up the past, looking for the mummies, right? Raiders of the Lost Ark. Did you guys like those movies? Tomb Raider? No?
It's okay.
You,
I
you
know
weren't
they're
into
like
those?
very like I don't know, popular movies.
I thought that was always fascinating. Like Indiana Jones, when I saw that, that was 1981. I saw that movie in the theater and like, man, that was like so cool. you know, Seeing these archaeological digs and they're finding stuff. I was like, wow. I almost wanted to become an archaeologist after that, but lo and behold, I became a trombonist and see how that turned out. But yeah, so archaeology is interesting, and I like the way he's tentative about this. He says you can't use archaeology to prove the Bible. Do you guys pick up on that? So you can't use archaeology to prove it, but you can use archaeology to what's the word he wants? What's the word he uses there? To reinforce, to substantiate the biblical record. So keep that in mind as we read this chapter. We're not trying to prove Christianity. Oh, look at they found, this thing, this artifact in the dirt. Therefore, the Bible's true, right? It doesn't work that way, right? You can't use archaeology to say, well, see, the Bible's true. You're not going to find King David's tomb, right? We're not. Well, who knows? We might, but yeah, we're not going to find things that are going to say, oh, see, there it is. And someone's going to, dramatically, what I say, beyond all reasonable doubt, some archaeological dig is going to prove the Bible, right? So it's not like that. It's not like there's going to be some dig somewhere. Though, like Dan Brown in his book, The Da Vinci Code, and I think the one after it, Angels and Demons, I can't remember if that was a title, trying to show that archaeology can disprove the Bible. But even that is, so you dig up something and say, oh, look at here, there was no crucifixion, and we haven't found any crosses in Israel. Yeah, well, I mean, crosses are made out of wood. Okay, they rot, they deteriorate. Yeah, you may never find a actual cross, right, in Israel. That doesn't mean they didn't have them. It didn't mean the Romans didn't use them, right? We just can't find them. So part of the problem is 95% of the items that people use every day, they degrade, they disappear within years, or even, within a century, they're gone. Right. So you're not gonna dig up clothing. You're not gonna dig up, certain things simply because they just don't last. And we saw we had the same problem with, the biblical documents. Right. It's really hard to find biblical documents that are 2,000 years old because the materials just don't last that long. Right. They rot, they corrupt. Though we did get fortunate in finding a lot of fragments in the desert where the dry sand and the heat preserved the papyri for 2,000 years. But for the most part, you're not going to find papyri in Italy or Asia Minor, right? You're not going to find it. It's going to rot. It's going to be gone within several years, or within 100 years at least. So you're not going to find a lot of the artifacts that are used every single day. One of the cool finds was, I don't know if you guys remember the Pompeii. Have you guys heard of Pompeii? It's an island off of Italy, and Mount Vesuvius erupted back in, I don't know, 37 AD. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was like in the first or second century. And the whole city was covered in volcanic ash. And so when they went in and they excavated it, I mean, they found everything basically preserved by the volcanic ash. So that was pretty cool. So you do get lucky sometimes, and you find things that have been preserved for 2,000 years in a really advanced like Roman studies, because there's a Roman colony, a Roman settlement there, and so there's frescoes on the wall, there's food on the table, the dog is still there, people are sitting around, or they're walking, they're in the streets and they're just covered because the ash just came down so fast and covered everybody. Because that's pretty rare, though. It's pretty rare to find that kind of stuff. So you might find a spoon here, or a piece of pottery there, or an amulet here, a ring there, a coin here, coin there. But you're not going to find, all the stuff. You're not going to find everything intact. So it's really hard to prove anything or disprove anything with archaeology, and you do get a lot of conjecture. Right, so you get a bowl, right, and you get a guy's wearing a hat, and you say, "Oh, all men in the ancient world wore hats." Well, maybe nobody did, and someone just drew a picture of a guy with a hat, right? You don't know. How would you know, right? Well, that means everyone wears hats. Well, maybe just one person wears a hat, and it looked kind of cool. So some guy thought, "Hey, that'll look really cool on a vase," and he draws it on a vase, but no one else is wearing hats, but so you don't know. It's really hard to extrapolate. And so sometimes you'll read, especially people who popularize archaeology, like a Dan Brown, right? He'll take an archaeological find, or he'll take an ancient document, and he'll find one phrase in it, and he'll extrapolate from that and say, "Oh yeah, look at there was this or that, or wasn't this or wasn't that." And so you have to be really, really careful how you use the archaeological data. For example, in Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, there are other gospels besides the four that we have, right? And one of them is, I think, the Gospel of Thomas. I think he draws from. I've read them all. I've read all these. And this one liner says, "And Jesus kissed Mary," and Dan Brown says, "on the lips." And see, Jesus and Mary were lovers, and they had a child, and that's the whole story. And of course, the main female character is the descendant of Jesus, whatever, right? So he makes this whole story out of this text that he pulls out of context. But if you go back and you see the document, and it says Jesus did something, right, to Mary, and then it's blank. Did he kiss her on the hand? Did he kiss her on the forehead? We don't know, right? There's nothing in the text. The text is broken, is gone, right? But he makes it up, and now he can say, "Oh, see, Jesus," and so you make all this stuff up, with small little bits and fragments of archaeological evidence, and you can sell books and become a millionaire and things like that, but it doesn't mean it's true. So you have to be careful. You can't use archaeology to say, "Look, at the Bible's true because they found, an amulet that has King David's name on it." Okay. Yeah, it means that King David probably was a king. There was a Davidic dynasty, right? Was that King David's? Probably not. Maybe one of his great grandsons, or someone in a royal family, so it was of the house of David, right? So there's a house of David inscription. Yeah, it corroborates the fact that David did exist, probably was a real person, but it doesn't prove it, right? So you have to be very careful. So I thought that was good that he says you cannot prove Christianity to be true with archaeology. But on the other hand, up until about the 18th century, the 19th century, the 1800s, before archaeology became popular, a lot of liberal scholars said, well, the Bible is just made up stories. They're all, just fables, because look at these cities don't exist. We don't see them today, right? These customs, they don't exist today, right? And so the Bible just made them up. But in the 1800s, they start digging and they find these cities, right? Almost every major city in the Bible has been discovered, or evidence of it is there. So the cities and the place names are real, right? The writer just didn't make these up. They actually exist. And a lot of the customs as they dig down and they, for example, 2000 BC, they find evidence of certain family customs we'll look at and say, wow. So what Abraham and Sarah was Abraham's sister, his half-sister. Oh, that's really strange. No one would marry their sister. We find out that was a common practice, right? And even the pharaohs at that time all married their sisters, all right? Keep the crown, right? Even the English, right? The English for many years, they inbred. You marry a relative to keep the crown within the bloodline, right? So a couple people married outside the bloodline. He dies without a son, right? Then the crown goes to France. Oh my gosh, what do you do, right? And so that was a common practice. So you look back at the story of Abraham and Sarah, it's like, well, yeah, it makes sense. Does it prove that Sarah was Abraham's sister? No, but it does show that it was a common practice. Therefore, it lends credibility to the story. And so up until the 19th century, liberal scholars believed that all these people's places, events were just fictitious. They were made up, no basis in reality. But as they begin to dig, right, discovery after discovery after discovery begins to show that all of these people, all of these places, all of these events could have taken place, right? There is physical evidence that is possible for them to have taken place. So the names of the places and the people mentioned in the Bible, right, give us a rich background for the biblical history, the biblical culture, the things like that, and it does ring true. So it's good. By the middle of the 20th century, it became recognized that almost every biblical story is verifiable through archaeological discoveries. Doesn't prove it, doesn't mean it actually happened, but it fits what we now know. Does that make sense? So you have to be careful how you explain that. You just can't run around saying archaeology proves the Bible. It doesn't, but it definitely does support it. And now for sure, it's very hard for liberal scholars to say it's all made up. Right? There's no scholar who is honest. There's scholars out there who write books, right? Dan Brown, who will write books and lie to you and make stuff up and get rich and become popular or whatever. But if you're honest and you look at the data with an open mind, you say, yeah, Bible's probably true. Pretty hard to come across that. So we have this W.F. Albright, Johns Hopkins University, states, there can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. So, and that's a liberal scholar. This is not a evangelical, Bible-believing, Holy Spirit-filled preacher. This is, a pretty liberal scholar. And even Miller Burroughs, of Yale University, again, not another evangelical, says, on the whole, however, archaeological work has unquestionably strengthened confidence in the reliability of the scriptural record. More than one archaeologist has found his respect for the Bible increased by the experience of excavation in Palestine. Archaeology has in many cases refuted the views of modern critics. It has shown in a number of instances that these views rest on false assumptions and unreal artificial schemes of historical development. And this is a real contribution and not to be minimized. Right. So back in the 1800s, 1900s, there were a lot of liberal scholars who developed. This is the era of Freud, Marx, right? All of these German Jewish intellectuals, Freud, Marx, Bauer. I mean, you have all these people, and they come up with these grand, Darwin, right? These grand schemes that explain everything, but aren't based on observable data. Does that make sense? So evolution, Darwin writes, is that origin of the species, not based on evidence. He doesn't study the evidence and build up his theory. He comes up with this theory, and then he goes and looks for the evidence to support it. Same with Marx. Karl Marx is, the way history works. It's not true, okay? Marx's theory has been proven wrong over and over and over again, but people still love it. Bultmann in scripture. And so these people, right, create these big theories that are very, very compelling. They explain everything, and you can believe in them without having to believe in God, basically. So there are explanations, there are alternate explanations for how the world works. Freud, I mean, all this Freud stuff, Freud is an idiot. Nothing Freud said is true, right? But everyone is into Freud, right? But it's demonstrably false now, but everyone was into Freud because he had this grand theory of how the mind works, not based on evidence. And so a lot of these early scholars, they had these theories about how, religion developed, and therefore Moses could not have given the law, right? That had to been written 200 or 2000, 100 or 1500 years later or whatever, 500 years later, by somebody, and put in and later added to the biblical record and written back in, because there's no way in the development of history and of a religion that would happen, right? And so they come up with this grand scheme. They say, well, this couldn't happen, therefore it didn't happen. But now archaeology is kind of, hey, yeah, it did happen. These things did happen. It did happen this way. So most of those theories have been thrown out. They're disproven, though people will still read those books and be influenced by them. And so you may run into people who believe in these theories, and they're being passed down. They're being popularized today. But even though no legitimate scholar would publish an article or a book based on them. So archaeology has definitely blown away almost all of that liberal nonsense. There's no data for it. So the data is showing that, yeah, the biblical record, the way the Bible is presenting the history of Israel, the history of the early church, is true. And so I think that the archaeology then does give us confidence, can give us confidence that the Bible is true. It doesn't prove it's true, but it definitely clears a lot of the misconceptions. So biblical history is concerned. Some specific biblical events, he says, have been verified, and the overall background and the culture and practices of the Bible times is filled in. So archaeology really helps us to kind of see, how did the average person live, let's say back in the day of Jesus, or back in the day of David, back in the day of Moses. What were the cultures things? What were the cultures like around Israel? What were they doing? The Bible really helps us to get a good feel for that. So it adds color. It adds color to the story, and it helps the story ring true. And those apparent points of conflict between the biblical record and what people thought, right, couldn't happen, has been surprisingly cleared up. We talked about that. And so archaeology has definitely been doing that. It's clarifying the cultural history. And then he here's the point he says here, what page is that? Page, I think, 109. He says, it's important to remember that we cannot prove the Bible by archaeology, nor do we believe in the Bible based on the basis of archaeological proof, but God ultimately confirms the spiritual truth of the scripture as we read it. We talked about that in the first lesson. So we're not trying to prove the Bible. We're not trying to, make people believe, hey, I got all these facts, therefore believe this Bible's true. But these facts, archaeology, help us clear up, answer questions, so that we can get them to read the Bible, right? And then the Bible can speak to their heart, or you can remove mental blocks so that they can hear God's voice clearly. So keep that in mind. That's what we're trying to do here. Historical details repeatedly confirmed by archaeology inspire our confidence to look beyond the historical events to the true story, the God story, the his story of history. So archaeology helps us then to enter into God's narrative and hear what God is saying through the Bible. Some of the sources of archaeology, did you guys pick up on that? There's more than 25,000 archaeological sites now in in Israel, Asia Minor, Greece, places where the biblical events have taken place. 25,000, that's a lot. I mean, if you go to Israel, there's archaeological digs everywhere. And I remember sitting in classes at Trinity with, some of my profs. They were actually, during the summer, they'd be in Israel digging. Oh yeah, we found this, we found that. And they'd be talking about, the stuff that they're finding every day, and they're finding things every day. So 25,000 sites are connected with the Old Testament period, have been located in the biblical lands. Most of the major cities of the Bible can be identified. And the inscriptions that we find in these sites, right, compare to what's going on. And we find, like in Egypt, you find the list of the kings. You go to Samaria, you find the list of the kings. You go to these other regions and you find historical lists. And what happens, you begin to say, yeah, that matches up with what's happening in the Bible, right? Because the Bible does mention Egypt. The Bible does mention these other nations. And then you look and say, yeah, when this guy was living, he was interacting with this guy over in this other nation. And you find out, yeah, that makes sense. That was what was happening in these other nations at that time. And so you find this feathering, this dovetailing of the biblical record with the historical records of all these other nations and other areas around as well. So it's kind of cool to find that. We'll look at a couple of specifics for as examples. And also we have pottery, stones, walls, coins, artifacts, right? All of these help us understand the culture. But again, we have to extrapolate from that. You find a coin in a house. What does that mean, right? You find a dog bone. What does that mean? The dog was their pet. The dog was their meal, right? The dog came in after they were gone. I mean, the dog ate that. I mean, we don't know, right? You just find a dog bone. You have to be very careful how you interpret that. Excavation of biblical sites tell us how people lived, how they built their houses, how they interacted, how far they had to walk, how big their towns were, what kind of construction materials they used, and things like that. So we get an idea of what was happening in those biblical times. So how do they date? Did you pick up on that, Phil? How do they know what the date is of an archaeological find? So how do we know that's King David's era? How do we know that's when Jesus lived? How do we know that's when Joshua lived? How would you know? Did you pick up on that?
Is it just based on during those specific periods? I guess with like kings, for example, there's like a certain way they would document their names.
Okay, so one would be writings would be in a certain way, maybe a certain script, right? So in this era, they used this type of script, and this era they used a different type of script, or maybe in a different alphabet. And so you find pottery with inscriptions written this way. Okay, that's this era. Then you find pottery or inscriptions written that way. Okay, that's a different era. So that's one way. That's definitely one way. Even fashions in pottery is one of the major ways, because pottery kind of lasts, right? You bake the pottery, it breaks, falls in the earth, and you pick it up and you say, oh, and you can look at that pottery and you can see the design of the pottery, and you can actually see, in 2000 BC they made bowls this way. 1500 BC they shaped their bowls this way. In 1000 BC, they shaped their bowls this way, and you can actually see this progression going. So if you do find a bowl that's shaped this way, say, oh, that's 2000 years BC. Could be someone imitating, but you have a pretty good chance that the style of the pottery will help you date. Just like you can look at a photograph. Oh, that's the 1980s. That's the 60s. That's the hippie era, right? You just tell. It's like, oh my God, look at those sideburns, right? It's the 70s, right? Bell bottoms, yeah, and fashions change, right? Doesn't mean that someone in the 2023 couldn't have sideburns and frizzy, puffy hair and the flower shirt and the sideburns looking like a hippie. It could, but but not everyone's dressed like that. So you can kind of say, oh, that's from the 70s, that's from the 80s, that's from the 90s, just through the fashions that you see. Or you look at the cars, right? You see the cars in the picture. Oh man, that's a Model T, right? Well, it could be today, but people still have Model Ts. But if you see, you see a Tesla, it's not 1950, right? Wow, look at a picture of a Tesla. That must be 1950. It can't be, right? Can't be 1950, right? So it dates, right? Certain models of the car will date when that picture could have been taken place. Again, you find a Model T, that could be 2023. Someone still might have a Model T. But if you find a Tesla, it's not. It's not 1900, right? So you can date things by fashion. Inky, how else can they date archaeological digs? Giving you time to think, Ashley.
They have a list of events and people dating back to 2000 BC. And so some of these might be drawn up by scribes that catalog the kings to which the dynasties are associated with.
Yeah, so the court records, right? They kept records. So during King so and so, this happened, right? We attacked Egypt, and during this king, Egypt attacked us, and during this, right? And so you have these lists of events, right? Now they don't say 2500 BC or 1985 BC, say in the 5th year of King so and so, right? So and so of Egypt marched up and attacked us. Yeah, you'll find those lists of events, and that will help you date archaeological digs. What else do they use, Ashley?
Like the architecture itself.
Okay. So architecture changes. And just like pottery changes, right? And if you find iron, right? You're probably in the Iron Age. You find bronze, you're probably in the Bronze Age. You're probably not going to find iron, in the Bronze Age, right? So if you find a piece of iron, it's not bronze, right? Because they weren't able to create iron at that time. It was impossible. They didn't have the technology for it. So same with buildings, right? Certain constructions you couldn't do, right? So you go to Europe and you see a building, and well, that could not have been constructed in 1500. They didn't have the technology to do that. They didn't have the materials to do that. And so, yeah, you can date it by the architecture. But I think the most common way, and I think he points it out, is most of these sites are layered. Right, so someone builds a city, and maybe the city's conquered, is burned to the ground. Dust covers over it. Someone comes in, hey, this is a nice place for a city. They build a city on top of it. Maybe they move out and it kind of crumbles, and right then someone else, hey, let's build a city here, right? And so they're building cities and towns in the same place over and over and over again. And so you'll get layer after layer after layer after layer. And as you dig down, oh, here's one civilization. Oh, here's another. And the further down you go, common sense would be the older the civilization, right? So if you find an artifact up here, oh, that's going to be fairly recent. You find an artifact way down at the bottom, hey, that must be fairly old, right? Unless there was some kind of upheaval, but maybe not, probably not. So you can probably assume by the layer that you find the artifact is probably going to be the layer at which the time period from that. Now, it doesn't mean someone couldn't have found, a nice amulet, nice gem, maybe it passed down from his grandmother to great grandmother, 15 generations, and then he dies and it's found up here. Yeah, it was made, 500 years earlier, but you find it 500 years later because it's been passed down. That's possible. And you say, wow, this is kind of weird. This is kind of like 2000 BC kind of artifact, but it's found at 1500 BC level. Okay, maybe, maybe someone found it, right, kept it and passed it on or something like that. But for the most part, you find it on a layer where other 2000 BC items are found. You're probably pretty confident you find a piece of pottery. Hey, this is probably 2000 BC, right? And then you go to another site and say, hey, wow, look at this pottery is the same as this pottery. And on this level, this pottery is the same as this pottery. And you say, wow. And then, so now you go to another and you find a piece of pottery, you say, hey, that's probably 1500 BC, because it kind of matches all these other places that have, right? And so even though you can't, maybe it's not stratified, you can probably guess by doing that. So that's probably the primary way that they do it. These sites are layered. And just like, even today, right? People do excavations, they build a house, and they find, like Indian arrowheads, right? You ever hear about that? Wow, this you want to build a house, and you find us an Indian grave. Ooh, don't build your house there, right? Poltergeist was the movie I remember seeing that. They built their house on an Indian graveyard, and that's why there's ghosts, right? Running through their house, right? So you find those archaeological remains that under your house collapses, let's say 500 years later, someone starts digging, they find, 3, 4, 5 different houses were built on your site because there's remains from all the different houses that were built on your lot. So that's probably the primary way that they do that. So that's helpful to understand. And again, so someone says, hey, this is 2000 BC, be skeptical. Say, well, how do you know it's 2000 BC? Well, I found it here. Okay. Any other thing that you can verify to help vouch for the fact that you say it's that? And so you want to just don't take people's things at face value. You want to find 3, 4, 5 reasons why they believe it's from that era. Right. And you say, okay, that makes sense. We found it at this level. It has this design. It was with this, it fits in with this list of events, right? Oh, okay, you're probably right. And so that's how the dating works. 2000 BC, Abraham's time. I thought that was interesting. 3 cities. What were the names of 3 cities that were unearthed from 2000 BC? Remember those names?
Mari, Nuzi, and Allah.
Alach, yeah, Alalak. Yeah, so 3 cities that are found that they've been able to verify are 2000 BC. That's the time of Abraham. It's pretty cool. So now we know that how people lived in the time of Abraham. And these sites actually shed light on business, political, government, culture, social aspects of the Abraham story. Like I said, for example, marrying one's sister or half-sister was common. Remember, Abraham didn't have a son. He says, well, let my servant, let him be my heir. Well, that was a very common practice. If you didn't have a son, you would adopt someone in your household, a servant in your household, and he would become the heir. God says, no, it can be from your own body. Then, of course, Sarah says, hey, take my handmaid, Hagar, right? Because I can't have a son. She can have a son for you. Of course, he has Ishmael through Hagar. That was a common practice. In fact, it was law in some of those towns, in some of those sites. They found legal document saying, if your wife does not produce an heir for you, she must provide for you a surrogate. It was law. It was why you're getting married. You get married because you want to have kids, right? You need to have an heir. So if your wife can't produce an heir, she's legally obligated to give you a handmaiden or whatever. And so what Sarah did was not unusual. It was the custom. Maybe she even felt legally compelled to offer Hagar to Abraham, right? So, kind of sheds light. And so what these things that are happening in the Abraham story, they're happening in all these other towns that they're digging up. And so it's not unusual for that. 20,000 cuneiform tablets were found in Mari, like a whole library of tablets. From finance, I mean, you would love it, Inky. You can go through and see all the financial transactions. So many, so many bushels of grain, so many cores of wheat, so many, right, of this and that, and I made this much money, and yeah, so all the financial accounts, agricultural accounts, historical accounts, even prophecies, and even literature. From this time, Epic of Gilgamesh is a great story found over in Samaria on cuneiform tablets. I've read that like 3 times. It's a wild story. So you have literature from 2,000 years, 1,500 years BC, and it kind of jives with what's going on in the biblical record. So that's kind of cool. A jar with treasure and inscriptions dating 2,500 BC. So we do have evidence of Abraham's time. 3rd millennium BC, excavated near Elba, produced another archive of documents, another huge library. So the Elba documents dating all the way back to 5,000 years ago. So it's kind of cool. You can kind of dig through the personal records and the stories and the financial records of people who lived 3,000 BC. That's pretty cool. For my dissertation, I had to read several. I had to read like 100 letters, personal letters, from the 1st century AD. But still, that's 2,000 years. Kind of cool. You're reading letters that people actually wrote to, their business associates, their wives, their children, their neighbors, their benefactors. It's kind of cool. It's like, wow, you get a picture into life in those times. And so it's really shed a lot of light on the biblical record. Israel's kings. Did Solomon really build a temple? What do you think, Ashley? Come on. That story. Gold, all that gold. Solomon had gold everywhere. Come on. Do you believe that story? That's just a children's fable. What do you think, Ashley? How would you answer somebody? There's no way Solomon could have built a temple with all that gold. It's made up. It's a Sunday school story. Kids love it.
I mean, I believe it.
I believe it. Well, that's fine. I mean, and that may be your only answer, but is there any evidence that that's even possible? I mean, Solomon got 666 talents of gold a year. I'm not quite sure how much that is, but that's a lot of gold. And it says that there was so much gold in Jerusalem during Solomon's reign that silver was considered not even valuable. It's like, man, that's just hyperbole. Come on. And he's got a golden altar. He's got golden wash basins. He has golden candlesticks. He has the door. I mean, everything's overlaid with gold. There's gold everywhere. The floor is gold. I mean, this is incredible. That's a lot of gold. What do you think, Phil? Made up story?
Yeah. I just feel like even reading in the Old Testament about Solomon, like there's just so much Yeah, so much gold. But it mentions here that they found the Megiddo Gate,
Mhm.
which definitely does like was a huge one of many Solomon's huge building projects.
Yeah, with his inscription on it.
Hmm.
That's crazy, right?
Yeah.
But they've also found other sites in the surrounding areas where they actually had gold refining factories, massive gold refining factories, right? Not just making, a little bit of gold here and there, but we're talking mass producing gold. Well, who's mass producing gold if 1000 BC? King Solomon, right? So you say, oh, he couldn't have done it. Well, we have the factories where this gold was being refined, right? And we even have an inscription found near Tel Aviv saying, Ophir gold for Beth Horon, 30 shekels. So we know that there was a place called Ophir, which was known for its gold. And that's an inscription found at the same level as Solomon. And so the fact that Solomon was getting gold from Ophir makes sense. Other people are getting gold from Ophir. Why can't Solomon? And if he's got these big factories outside of Jerusalem to mass produce refined gold, why not? Why couldn't he have done it? Who else is doing it, right? Who else at 1000 BC is refining tons and tons of gold? Yeah, the biblical story makes sense, right? So we have inscriptions of the kings of Israel. We find stelae. I think they're with stories on it, and you have the king's names on it, and you have these events. This happened. This happened. This happened, and you find these stelae in other nations. And we'll see one where Moab, right? There's a battle between Moab and Israel, and the name of the Israelite king is actually on that stone over in Moab, right? Hey, we had a battle with the king of Israel, right? And we kicked his butt, right? I thought that was kind of funny. So yeah, we kicked his butt, and there it is, Israel's Moab conflict stone. At Dibon, recounts the biblical event of Mesha, king of Moab, with the help of his god Chemosh, and he overcame King Omri of Israel. It even calls the God of Israel Yahweh. Wow, that's pretty cool. So here we have an inscription outside of Israel talking about a biblical event, a battle with the actual king's names, corroborating the story of 2 Kings 3, even using the name Yahweh, our God Chemosh, and their God Yahweh, right? So story's probably true, right? Does it prove it's true? No, but it's kind of unlikely that someone would chisel a stone with the exact same names and everything like that. The coincidence is too great. And it's at the same, same date at the same level, and things like that. So, and then Daniel and Belshazzar, I think that's kind of an interesting story, because Daniel says Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. Remember the handwriting on the wall? Meeny, meeny, tinkle, tinkle, parson, right? And the king's like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Your king has been measured, you've been found wanting. It's going to be given to the Medes and the Persians. And that night, right, Cyrus comes in and takes over the kingdom. And it's like, wow. But if you read the Babylonian tablets, you read the Babylonian inscriptions, Belshazzar wasn't the king. Oh, Daniel, he's just making this up, right? But just recently they found an inscription, and they found out that the king, what's his name? Nabonidus, took a 10-year leave of absence from the throne to go into Arabia. We don't know why, but he went into Arabia for 10 years and left his son in charge. And while he's off in Arabia, his kingdom falls, right? And so Daniel's right. Yeah, Belshazzar wasn't the king, but he's the king. He's doing the king's job, right? And he's the one who kind of destroys the kingdom, loses the kingdom for his father. Just don't trust your kids, right? They just ruin everything. And so the story's corroborated. It's kind of cool. Also, King Cyrus, I mean, after Jerusalem fell 587 BC, Jeremiah said, hey, after 70 years, God's going to call you back. And lo and behold, the Bible says 70 years later, King Cyrus, after he takes over Babylon, makes a decree saying, hey, go back up and build the temple. Oh, that's so fanciful. But we found stones written in multiple languages. Not only did he tell the Hebrews, not only he told the Jews they could go build their temple, he told all these other nations that the Babylonians had captured and brought to Babylon, said, you guys can go back to your nations and build your temples. And so there's an inscription, word for word, from 2 Chronicles and from Nehemiah, on a stone tablet, saying, you have the right to go up and rebuild the temple. May your God be with you. I mean, that corroborates the story. I mean, it's one of the most incredible finds, I think. And I'm not sure why he doesn't mention that. I think the Cyrus stone is mind-boggling, that they're actually uncovered an inscription that's almost word for word of the biblical account. New Testament, little different. Most of what we have for the New Testament is based on documents. Though we do find coins, we do find inscriptions, we do find things like that. But most of it, most of the interesting stuff is coming from documents. Though we do, from Roman. I mean, there's people out there doing Roman history, doing Greek history, doing history of Asia Minor and things like that. And we're finding culture, and we're finding things like that. But we're finding inscriptions that verify the biblical event. In fact, Paul talks about a guy named Erastus, who was the director of public works, I think, in Corinth. I should look this up. And they've actually uncovered a stone with an inscription. This building was erected by Erastus, the public. Boy, what are the chances of that? Some guy named Erastus at the same time, who's the public works director, builds something, and Paul is writing his letter saying, hey, say hi to Erastus, the city public works administrator. So that's kind of cool, right? Does it prove the Bible's true? No, but it really definitely lends some reality to it. One of the things in the New Testament, people made fun of Luke, right? Luke comes across, hey, I'm this very serious historian, and I've studied these events, and I've looked at all these records, did all these interviews, and I'm writing to Theophilus to give you the most accurate account, right? And if you read the Gospel of Luke, Luke is throwing out names and places left and right. He's using titles for these people, and for hundreds of years, biblical scholars are like, what is Luke doing here? These people don't exist. These aren't real titles. This place doesn't exist. But as they uncover they do excavations, they're finding out, no, this guy actually was the proconsul in this part at that time. And he was actually called this instead. Right? And so you'll find that the traditional title was this and this and this. Say Luke is wrong, but they find out, yeah, but this guy came in and he had this title, same title that Luke gave him. Quite interesting that Luke was there. He knew the guy, right? He interviewed the guy. He knows his title. He knows his name, and he's putting in the record. And now we're finding out 2,000 years later that guy really did exist. He really did have that title. So that's kind of fascinating. That Luke is a very, very careful historian, and time after time, every place that they think Luke is wrong in the Gospel of Luke in the Book of Acts, archaeology has shown over and over again that Luke is a very, very accurate historian. And so his record is pretty good. And so what he's writing about Paul is probably accurate, right? Luke was there, right? There's the we sections of the Gospel of Luke, right? There's like about three sections where several chapters and says, we did this, we did this, we did this. And then it goes third person, Paul did this, Paul did this, Paul. Well, the we sections, Luke was actually traveling with Paul. He was experiencing these events firsthand. I'm going to take his word for it over some biblical scholar 2,000 years later. Oh, that could never happen. Well, Luke was there. Probably did happen. That probably is the guy's name. That probably is his title. That probably is what happened. I'm going to trust Luke because he's shown himself to be accurate everywhere else. So I'm not sure why he doesn't put that in this book, but I should have looked that up and given you more evidence of that. But again, most of the New Testament documents were written on papyri. We don't have them, right? They're gone. They're all destroyed. Some were written on vellum, on leather. Some things were chiseled into stone or wood. But even wood doesn't last long, and things like that. So most of the documents that we have of the New Testament, earliest 300, 400 AD. Though we do have the Chester beaded papyri and several others that are like 125 AD, even maybe possibly 100 or 95 AD of the Gospel of John. So John's writing his Gospel 85 AD, and we have a fragment of that Gospel 10 years. That's pretty cool. So John's writing is that we have a copy of a copy probably from about 10, 15, 20 years after John actually wrote that book. Now, it's not the whole book, it's a piece of it, but still, it lets you know that John really did write this book. It wasn't written in 200 AD, 300 AD, like Dan Brown says it is. Oh yeah, the Gospel of John's written. No, we have proof that it was written in the first century by John himself, not some weird person a couple hundred years later. We have a physical fragment of his book from AD 100, right? That's pretty cool, right? Doesn't prove the whole gospel, right? But it shows that it was there. That book had to exist in the first century for someone to have copied it. So that's pretty cool. And then we have stone inscriptions. The Edict of Claudius is interesting. In AD 52, Claudius made an edict. We have evidence of that edict from a stone in Delphi in central Greece. And Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. Again, Luke, what? No, he wasn't. Yeah, no, we found out he was actually proconsul appointed in AD 51. He would have been proconsul at AD 52 when Paul was there ministering in Corinth. So that really helps us to establish the chronology. So we know Paul was in Corinth in AD 52 because he mentions the guy named Gallio. Gallio was proconsul. He's brought before Gallio in AD 52. And we know that Gallio, from this inscription, was indeed the proconsul of Achaia at that time. The other thing that he mentions here, Lysias, the tetrarch of Abilene. Oh, Luke, you're so weird. You're so funny. Ha, ha, ha. During the ministry of John the Baptist began around AD 27. Well, lo and behold, we find an inscription in the territory of Abilene that's dedicated to Nymphaeus, a free man of Lysias, the tetrarch. Okay, there it is. The guy was tetrarch from AD 14 to AD 29. And of course, John the Baptist, AD 27. Hey, he probably ran into this guy, right? He was running around when Lysias was tetrarch of Abilene. So there it is, right? We have archaeological proof that Luke is telling the truth. He didn't make it up. It really did happen. So I like that. I think it's kind of cool. It's not a pious forgery. Right? The New Testament is not made up. It's not some people saying, hey, let's write a book to fool people into thinking Jesus is God, died on the cross. Let's make this all up. And, no, this really did happen. These things actually did happen. Coins, we're finding coins like Felix and Festus. Remember that in Acts 24, Felix is replaced by Festus, and Paul goes before Festus and gives his defense. And we know that Nero actually had a coin minted in AD 59, and they found coins of that, Felix and Festa, commemorating that. Yeah, and Paul was there. Paul actually talked to both of these guys. Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. The Romans built another city over it in AD 135. Yet, as you dig down through that layer, you can find out, okay, here's the AD 135 layer, right? And we know that's AD 135. They can find it because it's pagan, right? It's not Jewish. Then you dig down one layer deeper and you find all this Jewish stuff. Pretty cool, right? And that's the time of Jesus, right? Before the destruction. So anything that you find under that layer, you know, comes before AD 70, because that's when millions of Jews were killed and kicked out of Israel. And so you find you're finding the pool of Siloam. They're finding, I think they found the ossuary of Jacob or of James. They're finding all kinds of stuff from that layer right under the 135 layer. That's corroborating the New Testament. And they have the Hezekiah's tunnel is always a big one. That's so obvious. Hezekiah dug a tunnel. You can go to Jerusalem today and see the tunnel of Hezekiah, and it's chiseled into the rock. This tunnel was made by Hezekiah, right? So it's pretty cool. Hezekiah was a king. He did do that. He did actually chisel that tunnel, excavate that tunnel, things like that. So the Bible is true. It is the Word of God. If Buddha didn't exist, you could still be a Buddhist, right? If Confucius was just a made-up character, you can still be a Confucian, right? If Plato and Socrates and Aristotle didn't exist, they're just figments, you could still be a Platonic philosopher. You used to be an Aristotelian philosopher. It doesn't matter. But if Jesus did not physically, literally exist and die on a cross and rise from the dead, if those events didn't happen, then Christianity is not true, and it falls apart. So archaeology then really helps us to show that Christianity is a historical religion. Even the Old Testament, God is breaking into history. God rescues the Jews out of Egypt, brings them through the Red Sea, brings them to the desert, meets them at Mount Sinai, gives them the land of Canaan. But these are historical events. These are not simply children's stories. These are God breaking into history, doing incredible things to move his story along, to bring the line of Messiah to Jesus so that Jesus can be born, die on the cross. So the historicity of the Old Testament and the New Testament is very, very important to us. So the corroboration of the New Testament by archaeology, not the center of faith, not the foundation for our faith, but it does help us realize, these are real events. It is true. What I believe is the truth. It is historical fact, not just some story, not just some myth. There's Christians, if the Bible is not true, they wouldn't change their life at all, right? There's many people in the church, they don't believe in Jesus anyway. It's just a fun story. It helps me be a nice person. It's kind of, whatever. Not sure why they're coming to church, but, they're coming to church, but they don't believe it. So if it's not true, it doesn't matter. But if we believe that Jesus is the Son of God who's come in the flesh, died on the cross, rose again from the dead, is coming back, and we're going to live with him for eternity, then the historicity of that event, of the Bible, of all the Bible, is very, very important. Because if it's not true, there is no eternal life. If it's not true, you're just going to die and turn to dust, and that's the end. There is no hope. If it's not true, there is no forgiveness of sins. Just do the best you can. Good luck, right? Live the best life you can. God's not coming to help you, right? There's no spirit. There's no Jesus. There's no God. Just go out there and live the best life you can. Then you're going to die. It's all over. That's all you've got. If Jesus is not the Son of God who came and died for you, that's all you have. Okay? But I believe, and I base my whole life on the veracity, on the truth of the Bible. And I'm depending on that. My whole life is built on that. And that is my hope, and that is my purpose for living. And so archaeology is cool, it's kind of nice, and it does verify that, but that's not why I believe. I believe because I've experienced that in my life. I know that Jesus is risen from the dead, because why? He lives in my heart. He's changed my life. He's forgiven my sins. He is speaking to me every single day. Right. So does that make sense? Yeah. I'm gonna let you guys go. I will see you on Sunday. And Lindsay's going to be there too, right? Awesome. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. See
Thank
you
you.
later.
Thank you.